And we are live. Hey guys, this is Ruben from Dubb's podcast, Connection Loop, and I am on with Francisco. Francisco and I are going to get into this topic of story. In fact, I don't think a day goes by where I don't talk about the story arc, whether it's in a 30-second ad or whether it's in a social post or even a blog post. Story is so critical, and I think in our overall messaging and communication, especially for business in this day and age. So Francisco, if you could just start with a quick bio on yourself and let's get into this.
Sure. Bios are always a strange one because you wonder where you begin with that.
Yes. Where does the origin story begin? That's always the question.
Yeah, so I tend to introduce myself as a keynote speaker and storytelling coach. So that's the main part of it. But on top of those things, I do plenty of things to do with story. I give corporate training. When it comes to events, I also do particularly now, do a lot of event moderation, and I host a podcast, the Story Powers podcast.
And what would you say that we're lacking overall in the business world when it comes to storytelling?
Well, the main thing the business world is lacking with regards to storytelling is actual storytelling.
Is storytelling. So it's just a general lacking, okay?
So
I would agree with that.
Let's take a step back to that. No one lacks storytelling because storytelling is a tool. It's a vehicle. It's a way to communicate. So what the business world is lacking, in my opinion, is meaningful communication. Storytelling just happens to be the way human beings have evolved to communicate in a memorable, meaningful way. So the problem is not the lack of story. The problem is the lack of meaning and connection. It just so happens that story is the way to achieve that. And when we think about storytelling in business, there's plenty of storytelling in business. But if you look at what most examples that people have in mind, you get Nike and Apple tend to come up straight away when you talk about storytelling in business. But then you're usually talking about storytelling as an advertising tool. You're not talking about storytelling as a way to communicate internally, for leadership to communicate, for sales teams to communicate, for companies to generate engagement and get real feedback from their employees. So that side of storytelling is, in my opinion, the one that's lacking most. The one that's to do with ads and what you see on TV commercials, that one is pretty well developed. And although plenty of companies could do more there, it's not where storytelling is lacking.
And I would argue that I think the reason why we're lacking this type of storytelling, or a better way to tell stories in our messaging, is simply because we're not really connected to our audience and what their struggle is. I think for me, where I always feel comfortable is functioning as someone who's guiding another person and seeing the other person's success as the first and foremost goal of the initiative, of the campaign, of the relationship and whatnot. And if we set up that hero stage, I think it kind of opens up opportunities to create that arc. And it's not easy. It takes a lot of time. Some people make it look very easy and make it look very natural. But in fact, it's something that is a skill that needs to be practiced. There's all sorts of literature on this. There's Building a Brand Story, Miller's book. There's all sorts of text on this. And what would you recommend that we can do to develop that muscle?
The very first thing that most people need to do before they can start telling stories is listening to stories. They need story listening before storytelling. And so what I mean by that is just paying attention to who communicates in story in your company or outside of your company. And it's just a very simple exercise. As you speak to your friends, as you speak to your colleagues, just pay attention when someone is giving you facts, opinions, and statements. And when someone is saying, I hear what you're saying, and the other day this happened to me. That's a story they're going to tell you. So you notice that it happens a lot more than you think in your personal life, and it rarely happens in business. And if it does happen, those tend to be the people that you think as good communicators or as good leaders. So once you start training your brain and your ear for a story, it becomes a lot easier to figure out, okay, well, that works, that I like, and now is the time to start actually telling some stories. And the easiest way to do that is to always think of stories as not a story, because a story, the moment you say story, the brain freezes. People they don't have stories supposedly, but everybody has examples of things that happen to them or happen to people they know, happen to business they were involved with. So talk in examples. Don't talk in opinions. Don't talk in facts. And once you start doing that, you've essentially become a storyteller.
I really connect to that on multiple levels. I mean, I think back to some of the inspirations that I've received, some of the texts that I've received with respect to story. One of my book recommendations is Robert McGee's book called Story, which is actually a book that I read in a filmmaking class. There it is. You got it, right?
Right now.
So, what I love about this text is that it reminds us of some very important things, which is that stories typically start with problems, right? Problems stem into, I think, one of a few options. Number one is person versus self, person versus person, person versus society, person versus nature. And I think that as a starting point, when you look at some of those conflicts, it opens up opportunity to be a guide to support someone. So to bring the conversation back to business from screenwriting or just generally story, is that what we're trying to do is to provide value to people. And if we understand their problem, we can help them to be that hero that gets over the arc. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so you talked about the problem. I think people tend to complicate what stories are sometimes, and there are plenty of books, and you mentioned Story Brand by Donald Miller, which is really more of a marketing book and an advertising book than an actual storytelling book, because they at no point suggest that you tell stories. They suggest that you dissect the elements of a story to use in your marketing, particularly in your website. So this is how you come up with the first page of your website.
Yes.
But they use the hero's journey, which is the original hero's journey, I believe, has 12 different steps. Their simplified version has 7, but that's still a lot more complicated than most people can deal with. The way I tend to think of stories is pretty simple. It's you need to give people a context or a setup, then a problem or complication is going to come in, and that's going to resolve itself somehow. Right? So that sort of setup, problem, outcome, the structure is the way most people tell stories. I was walking home the other day, and I was just coming home from work, and I was a bit of a hurry because I had to get home and give dinner to the children. And then this guy stopped me on the street. And then, I don't know, the guy tells me something, and now I have to sort out whatever this guy is telling me. And then I do it, or I don't. That's it. That's the basic of a story. And I think that what people sometimes don't realize when we start talking about storytelling is that it's significantly simpler than they think it is. And if you are in business, I'm going to take a wild guess that you've somehow someday helped someone. Like they had a problem, then you help them solve that problem. And that is the most basic story in business that anyone can tell, right? And when you're talking to a different prospect or a client, that story sounds like, there was this client of mine, Bob. Bob was just like you, and he had a problem. And the problem made Bob feel bad. I helped Bob solve his problem, and now he feels good. And that's it. And that is the most basic story, and it takes little to no knowledge of storytelling to tell. You just need to know that you need to be telling it. And that's where I tend to suggest that people start, is just understanding knowing where to look for those basic stories that you can tell in business, because we all have them. Well, and if you have no stories, it's because you just haven't been in business at all.
Right. I love that. You have written a book, in fact, about public speaking called Bear.
Yes.
Talk to us about that process. What did you learn? What are some of the learnings from this that have resonated with people so much? Give us the hook and the teaser on this.
The process of writing a book. Wow. It's as hard as a lot of people make it sound. But to be honest, I didn't find it that hard. I think I did the whole thing from deciding I was going to do it to actually having it published in about 6 months. And the process I went through was I figured out that I wanted to write on public speaking, which is something I've done for a very long time, and I knew that brutally honest public speaking, so public speaking with vulnerability and authenticity, was the angle that I was going to have at it. So what I did once I had that core idea was I thought about an outline. I said, okay, so I'm going to have to talk about structure. I'm going to have to talk about delivery. I'm going to have to talk about storytelling. And then I said, okay, what are all the things that I know about these areas of public speaking? And then I just ended up with a very large list of things that I could talk about. And the way I wrote my book is they're not tiny chapters. I think they're just little items. So for example, I'm going to talk about, there's a little bit there that's called the space between. So I'm just talking about pauses. So that is, maybe 500, 600, 700 words. And all I'm talking about is that sort of a self-contained idea where I introduce it with some anecdote or some story. Then I talk about it. I teach people how to do it. And then I have a takeaway. And once I figured that was the format I was going to do, it was actually easy writing it. I know what I'm talking about. The only effort was saying, okay, what is the interesting angle that I'm going to give here? What is the story that I'm going to use to introduce this part of the subject? And then it was just sitting down and writing it. And I didn't have much time because I have small children and I have more than one job. And so it was 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, I would sit down, I would write for an hour, hour and a half. And I wrote about 200 pages in 6 months. And I did everything by myself. I self-published. I did all of that by myself on Amazon, which is not that hard. I really enjoyed the process. I thought that after I got going, I learned a lot about my subject, which I think most people that write books will tell you. And it just got me into the habit of writing, which became very useful when I started being active in social media. Because, most of my social media posts are writing, and I do one every day. And I developed that habit out of writing for the book every day for 6 months. If nothing else, it made me a significantly better writer than I was before.
And how would you say that this text and your general body of work applies to now digital speaking? The reason why I ask is we have started the process, Dubb as a company, we have started the process of hosting an online summit. In fact, it's called Action. Action is the name of our online summit, and it's an entirely virtual event where we are going to have hundreds of speakers on various topics within sales, marketing, communications, and beyond. In fact, side note, we would absolutely love to have you be a speaker in our virtual event, so we'll have to reach out to you about that. But what are some of the notes that you might suggest to people in either virtual speaking engagements or Zoom conversations that they're having with team members where they want to make an impact, to make influence? Give us some 2021 tips here.
Sure. There are some things that are super, super basic, and yet most people don't do them. So, well, now you share the screen, this will become slightly less obvious, but what you and the viewers will probably realize when they watch this is that throughout most of this, I'm looking at the camera. I'm not looking at your face. I can see your face in the corner of my eye, but I'm looking at the camera, which makes everybody feel like I'm looking at them. And this is very unnatural. I mean, it took me quite a while because my eyes kept going, getting blurry, but you get used to it. And now I can essentially do that for an hour or two, pretty much nonstop if I have to. And this makes a massive difference, because when the major difference between speaking online and speaking live for the audience is that the audience is so easily bored. It's so easy to be distracted. So there's a whole bunch of things that I'm having to adjust as well, because I was never the type of speaker that would use slides. Like, I hate slides. I would never have one if I could avoid it. Occasionally I will use a prop, but mostly I'm just using humor and telling stories and all of that. Now, that doesn't work as well online, because people are not going to look at you for 30 or 40 minutes. As much as I might fancy myself, no one is going to look at my face for 30 or 40 minutes while I'm speaking. So, I'm learning that you have to do a lot more things. You have to, I heard a speaker that I really respect called Thames and Webster describe this as engaging as many of the senses as you can. So there's nothing we can do to engage people's taste and smell, but we can engage their ears, we can engage their eyes, and we can engage their hands. So when you're asking people to write something on the chat, when you're showing them objects, when you have slides that change on a regular, kind of quickly enough, all of these things are keeping you engaged. I'm asking you questions, I'm having you respond. So I'm doing everything I can to keep you glued to the screen. And something else that I might try, because I've heard some people that I like saying that they've been doing, is you actually have people, this takes more preparation than a lot of people can do, but you have people, you give people a handout, even if it's an electronic one, and you make them do things on the handout or on a piece of paper. So they're shifting their attention between you on the screen and whatever you're telling them to do, but what they're not doing is checking the social media or trying to respond to some work emails while you're talking. So those are some of the things that people need to can do that are helpful. But I think in simple terms, look at the camera, lots and lots of interaction. Because if you don't have that, as amazing as a speaker as you might be, you just can't hold people's attention for that long, particularly when we are doing 5 or 6 of these meetings a day. It just doesn't work.
I completely agree with you. It's so easy to get carried away and to disconnect yourself from the viewer, when in fact, this is a simulated live conversation, a live engagement, and we need to emulate that as best as we can. One of the things that I've really found a lot of success with is actually making questions, comments, interruptions a natural part of the presentation process. Most of the new webinar softwares or a live situation, we use StreamYard. That's the technology that we're using here. There is the ability to comment, to chat, to ask questions, to do surveys, to do polls. And I think that those types of things are so incredibly important. And I think the reason why they're important is, I think, for a couple of reasons. Number one is because you keep the viewer engaged. But secondly is you get that data. You understand where people are at, what questions they have, what comments, where things are not necessarily completely clear. And then I think the third thing is that there's a social expectation that if other people are there present, putting comments into the mix, that so should everyone. Otherwise, they're just in the corner of the room with their back turned to everyone, being rude, frankly. So I think if we kind of play into that, I think it's a win-win-win, in fact, and I think it's really important.
Yeah, the only caveat to lots of interaction is interaction in the chat is very, very good, assuming whatever you're doing allows you to keep an eye on it. What is perhaps slightly harder to manage is interaction live with voice, asking someone a question and having them answer, because then you're always hostage to the guy who's gonna go, yeah, my company focuses on, and then they'll talk for 3 minutes before they actually ask a question, or they'll give their opinion on the subject instead of asking a question. So that can get tricky. But the chat is very useful, and if what you're doing is not so involved technically that you cannot check it, then yeah, by all means, people should make that part of their presentations, because otherwise you just lose people very fast.
Yeah, you're so right. In our webinars, what we do is we always have the housekeeping rules in the beginning, and those rules are: number one, comments engaged, keep them coming, all good. We have a separate person managing those. Where are you from? What problems are you trying to solve? What past experience do you have? The next thing is the questions and the questions section in Zoom, which I really like. It's a feature where you ask a question and then you either answer it live or you answer it in text. Someone else that's narrating or supporting can answer those questions so that those questions are resolved, and that just becomes fuel for additional content. So I agree with you. I think that the problem is that if people are not if you're not staying on the story, if you're not on the plot, then you're breaking the plot, and that just to bring it full circle to our conversation about story.
Yeah, it's a balance. I mean, I must be honest. I find that there's a lot of advantages from a professional point of view to all the remote work we're doing, and just this last between last week and now. So I did I did a lecture at a Latin American MBA in Argentina. On storytelling, and that was about 1 a.m. here in Spain, but I did it from sitting here in my living room. And then a few days later I was moderating a scientific event which just happened to be in Barcelona, and then next week I got something else that is in San Francisco. Now that is fantastic. If I had to travel for every single one of these things, the interruption to my normal life would be massive. But having said that, the energy and the enjoyment and the skills that I have suit themselves a lot more to speaking live. And that's all of what I've always done. I didn't know what Zoom was until I think January or February this year. So it's a learning experience, but I think that it's something we have to dive head first in, because even with vaccines and with things sort of going back to normal, this is going to be part of our lives at least for another 2 or 3 years, at least.
Yes.
And I wouldn't be surprised if major companies just decided, okay, we'll have one major event per year, everything else is online, because it's just cheaper, it's more practical, it's easier to organize. So people who don't get better at communicating this way are just going to be missing a step.
Yeah. That's it. That's the truth right there. We need to live in that, and we need to adapt if we haven't done so already. You have a lot of books behind you. Give us some book recommendations, please.
Okay.
Top 3 books that you recommend that we read to just change our lives.
Okay. Well, do you want them to be story based? Otherwise,
you pick three book recommendations.
Okay. So one book that, when it comes to story, is one of the best books for people that haven't necessarily looked into the subject, because it's just so filled with amazing stories, and it's a cracking read, and also very good in content-wise, is from Kindra Hall. It's called Stories That Stick. So that is definitely one of my favorites, and it's an amazing read. So very, very pleasurable. And you learn a ton about story. She's an amazing keynote speaker. She's on my dream list for the podcast. I'll get there eventually. What else? Other books that I could recommend? Well, if someone wants to read something that is just, this is just pure literature, right? So this is not. It's life-changing, perhaps in different ways. But there's a book that was made into a movie a few years back called The Road, from Cormac McCarthy, who's the same guy who wrote No Country for Old Men, and that is by far one of my favorite books. And it's perhaps given what we're going through now with the pandemic, might not be the book to read now, because it's a book about sort of apocalyptic end of the world. But it's one of the most beautiful books I've ever read, and I strongly recommend it. And in addition to that, geez. This is when I should have my list of best books updated. But I could probably suggest, Okay. So I've just read this, right? So I read this. I finished it yesterday, and I really loved it. And it's an amazing story. It's called The Force. So this is by Don Winslow. He's very well known for a book about the Narcos. So he wrote the Power of the Dog and the Cartel and the Border. And they're making Ridley Scott is making a TV show out of that now. But The Force is one book. Is about cops that mean well, but are perhaps not the best cops in the city, and go a bit wrong sometimes. But it's an amazing read for anyone who likes action, who likes thrillers, and who likes to try to put themselves into the lives of other people, which is one of the most powerful things stories can do for us. And this is one of those examples. You read that, you understand what it's like to be a cop in New York City. And nowadays, that's a pretty hot topic, and I think it's a great exercise in empathy and putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And again, extremely fun read. So The Force, The Road, and Stories That Stick.
Amazing. Great book, Rex, there. I wanted to just spend a quick moment on one of my favorite storytellers, Bob Dylan, who recently sold his catalog for a whopping $300 million to Universal.
Yeah.
And what's amazing about his stories, songs like All Along the Watchtower, Knocking on Heaven's Door, we've heard covers of these. Jimi Hendrix, Guns N' Roses, these are songs that have come to us in multiple generations, multiple formats. At the end of the day, these are stories. These stories, and this storytelling has won him the Pulitzer Prize. It's got him the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I think that it's important to understand that, Bob Dylan is not, when you think of pop music, when you think of one of the most memorable musicians, you might not think of Bob Dylan. You might think of the Beatles, you might think of the Rolling Stones, you might think of someone else. You don't necessarily think of Bob Dylan, but what Bob Dylan did that's so different is that he brought those stories to us that have that have stood the test of time, really. And I think that I just want to kind of leave listeners with an inspiration, thanks to you, that story is such an important part of our lives. And what it does is that it brings us legacy. When we're long gone, it's our stories that will permeate through our content, through our written work, through our videos. And I think the time is now to start sharing those stories. After all, there are no excuses.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think Bob Dylan does something very few musicians do, which is to have plenty of his songs are genuinely just stories from beginning to end. Hurricane being the example that comes to my mind. For 8 minutes, and it's just a story. He's just telling the story from beginning to end. And as you said, I think we human beings think in stories. Stories are how we communicate with meaning. Our stories are the most memorable way we communicate to each other and convey emotion, and they are the things that stay with us. I can bet that you can remember and care about stories you heard when you were a child, but you probably couldn't tell me something you heard in a business meeting last week. And that's just because we are made for stories. And I think that the earlier the people realize that, the richer their communication, both in business and outside, and their life will be. Because the last thing I'll say about story is that once you start thinking more like a storyteller, you start looking for the meaning in everyday things. And if anyone ever looks at the stories I put out on social media, they are the smallest, arguably least important things that happen in my life. And I get plenty out of them, and other people too, just because I learned to see them as stories and not just as things that happened.
Very cool. Where can we learn more about you? Where can we, your website, LinkedIn, you're very active on?
Yeah, so the easiest way to reach me is LinkedIn. I post pretty much every day there. My website is storypowers.com, and I have a podcast, the Story Powers podcast, which is on Apple, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are found. And that comes out every week, every Monday. And it's usually an interview with someone who works with story. So I talk to storytellers, I talk to professional speakers, I talk to branding and marketing experts, and occasionally I drop some of my own stories in there as a little bonus. But that one is usually an hour every week talking about every possible aspect of story. So anyone wants to find out more about story, listening to any of those episodes is my best suggestion. And if you want to see me telling stories, then just keep an eye on my LinkedIn or my YouTube channel. Every week or two I post a story there.
Francisco, thank you so much for your time. This has been a true arc, and I wanted to thank you for sharing this insight and this knowledge. And I would like to formally invite you to the online summit from Dubb, where we can co-host a webinar. And I think that the world needs to hear more from you. So thanks again, Francisco.
Thanks for your time, Ruben. This was fantastic. And yeah, hit me up and we'll organize that. I'd love to take part.
Thanks so much. Stick around and I'll share some notes with you.
Okay.